Very welcome, big welcome to all of you, and it's brilliant to be able to continue our series in the Beatitudes. We are sadly, I think, in our penultimate week. We've got one more week after this, and then maybe we'll see how we're doing after that. We could maybe sum up the week after that. We'll see how we're doing. But I've been really enjoying just listening to what loads of other people have shared. Kira's giving me a funny face because I think the first slide might have gone up. So I will crack on. Let's cut the intro short and let's cut to the chase here. Kira's just going like that. Yeah, well, it was great. So there's this thing called the marriage course that if you're engaged, you ever get engaged, you have the option to do. Some churches run it, some churches kind of just offer it as something to do. And the marriage course is all about talking through all the different things you might have to consider after you've tied the knot and your lives change forever. So there is a week in the marriage course on conflict. Has anybody done the marriage course? Anybody here? A few of us have done it. Yeah, pretty good, pretty helpful. Yeah. And there's a week on conflict. And on the week on conflict, they tell you that in a relationship, and this isn't just about marriages, of course, but this is where I learnt it. In marriages, you are either a rhino or you're a hedgehog. So that explains the slide behind me. You're either a rhino or a hedgehog in a state of conflict. You either charge head on with your horn sort of out, just looking to cause some proper damage and looking to let the world know that you are not happy. Pointed and ready to attack. That's you if you're a rhino. If you're a hedgehog, you're much more likely to want to avoid conflict. So when things get challenging, you'll want to stop the conflict by just shutting down, pretending that you're not there, just like a hedgehog that curls up in a ball and kind of sticks his prickly spines out so nobody can hurt it. So, little show of hands for the rhinos. Okay, cool. And a show of hands. Excuse me, you don't have to tell people to put their hands up. You are definitely a rhino. Wow. And one for the hedgehogs. Okay, cool. I think I'm probably a hedgehog. 100%. Okay. I mean, I wasn't going to get into our kind of stuff, but yeah. I was going to say, you can just guess in our marriage. But I definitely enjoy a glass of milk and sleeping in a garden. So we all have different relationships with conflict. We can view conflict as something to be avoided at all costs. We can be scared of it because we've had negative experiences before in our lives. We can run head on into conflict sometimes because we have no choice. But there are some people out there who actually relish heated conversations. Good luck to you. Don't understand you. So Jesus comes along in his big speech on the hillside, the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Can we say that this morning together? Blessed are the peacemakers. Which begs the obvious question, who is a peacemaker? And what does a peacemaker actually do? Very attentive this morning, Daniel. Wow. Listening very well. Does a peacemaker just do breathing exercises? Is it just about just getting into the zone? Does a peacemaker make us all hold hands in a circle in church and sing Kumbaya or Make Me a Channel of Your Peace, which is a great song. Jesus also said some stuff that kind of seemed to contradict what he'd said in the peacemaking chat. He said, "I've not come to bring peace, but a sword." He said that in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. He also called people names. The religious leaders that were around at the time, he called a brood of vipers and a bunch of snakes, which doesn't sound very peacemaking, does it? Matthew 12:34. I was kind of thinking, was Jesus a rhino or a hedgehog? I think different times, probably different roles. To the woman who reached out to touch the hem of Jesus' robe, his cloak, who was not very well, she was healed. Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. so now you can go in peace. Bit more hedgehoggy. And there are a lot of things in the Bible that at first glance, they don't really match up. You could call them contradictions, absolutely. And when we spot contradictions, well, for me at least, I see it as an invitation to just dig a little deeper. Okay, what's really going on here? And if we're going to make peace, we need to understand what type of peace we are talking about. One of the most common misunderstandings about peace is that peace is simply an absence of conflict. That peace is simply an absence of conflict. As long as nobody's making a fuss, we have peace. As long as everybody's being nice to each other and, there's no fighting or anything, as long as there's no trouble, it's peaceful. And we're often more keen to call for unity and pretend like everything's fine than we are sometimes to understand why there is a lack of peace in our world. Or sometimes we'll discount something because we don't agree with every single detail that maybe an oppressed group has to make. And so we just discount it. And we don't listen to why there is a lack of peace in the situation. There's a pastor in the USA called Melissa Flora Bixler, and she talks in a book that I just read of hers about how after Election Day in the States, her church used to meet and pray and share communion as a sign of unity, even though they had all sorts of different backgrounds and people from different political backgrounds and race and everything, economic backgrounds. And so I was reading this and I thought, that sounds amazing. It sounds awesome. They go and pray and they go and share communion. And I was thinking, we should definitely do that next time there's an election on in Scotland. And then she went on to say, until she cancelled it. I was like, oh, great, here we go. I'm about to learn a lesson here, aren't I? After a few elections, because she said it was a false unity that they had. She said that there were people in their church who didn't have enough money to live on, and their voices were being ignored within the church from week by week, day by day. And it was a false peace when they met to pray that she said it just made the people who had feel better, but didn't actually make any difference to those who had not. Didn't make any practical difference in their lives. It's a really challenging story, isn't it? I'm not saying I completely agree. I think, we've got to work these things out in our own context, but peacemaking requires wisdom, and peacemaking requires courage sometimes to be unpopular and say, I'm going to stand for something. So let's bring it closer to home a little bit. Let's just imagine that you lived in a place called Zen House, okay? Zen House. It's a very peaceful place. It's known for just no trouble at all. The police never turn up in Zen House, okay? And I just want you to imagine that your neighbors were at war, okay? Obviously, this would never happen in Zen House. Certainly never happened to me. And you just want everyone to get along. But there are real issues. Let's imagine that you live in a stairwell, say a block of 6, okay? And there are issues that you need to confront, okay, because you want to be a peacemaker. But let's say somebody's behavior is causing problems in that environment. What do? Do you join in on the pylon, on the one who's causing the trouble? Is that what you do? Or do you work with them and try and befriend them and get alongside them and take the risk of looking like you don't care to the other people that you live with? How do we bring the presence of King Jesus into these situations? Because what does peacemaking look like? Peacemaking requires wisdom. In that situation, not that I've ever been there, but I can imagine that situation would require wisdom. It also requires practice. You're not going to get it right every single time. But Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. It's a chance for us to practice. Even that phrase, to make peace with a situation, I think can be a bit misleading. Often that means, you just have to accept it. Well, what if we don't have to accept every situation that we find ourselves in? What if we as believers sometimes are called to be rhinos in the name of Jesus from time to time? Remember, the context for Jesus' words were him standing on this hillside, and he was talking to a particular bunch of people. I am talking to a particular wonderful bunch of people this morning. He was talking to a different bunch of people, and a word that they knew that we don't know quite as well this morning is shalom. Okay, say that together. Shalom. Turn to the person beside you and say, shalom. Shalom. So, shalom can be a greeting. In the Hebrew language, just means peace be with you, basically. But it's so much more than a hello, because really it's the concept and it's this idea that God's righteousness is being restored on the earth. So it's a really good idea and a really powerful idea. Righteousness, as Mary said a few weeks ago, is the way that things were designed. So the way that we were intended to live with God and the way that God's rule was intended to be lived out in our world. So we might think of peace just being a couple of weeks without any major social incidents. You know, your mum phones, how's it been going? Yeah, it's been quite peaceful. Yeah, it's been all right. But God sets a higher bar for peace. Peace isn't just the absence of conflict. Peace isn't just a quiet couple of weeks where nothing bad has happened. But peace actually is the reign of God being lived out in our world. Okay, so some of you might know this little passage from Isaiah. We normally only read it at Christmas. I make no apologies. For unto us a child is born, for unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor. We can read it together if you want. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. So where Jesus is king, like Isaiah is prophesying hundreds of years back, thousands of years back now, there is shalom. Where God is in charge, justice, righteousness, and peace are kind of the strong flavors that come out of life in his kingdom. So that's why in a guy called Shane Claiborne, in his community in the States, they take guns and they hammer them out of shape and they weld them out of shape and they turn them into gardening tools. Isn't that so cool? To cultivate goodness. So guns that, you know, particularly in the States, way more than over here, guns that cause people to live in a culture of fear, guns that have removed life, are being redeemed and repurposed, and their very existence is kind of almost being mocked a little bit, taking the rip out of guns by turning them into plowshares and spears and instruments that we can use for good. So they call it beating guns, as they beat them into these instruments for good. And this, I want to say, is peacemaking. And they are living in blessing. They are the children of God. And I want to be really clear as I can possibly be here. Peacemaking is not the same as peacekeeping. Peacemaking is not the same as peacekeeping. Peacekeeping says, isn't it great that we can all get along? While sometimes not acknowledging the massive inequalities that others can see in plain sight. That's peacekeeping sometimes. Peacemaking, what peacemaking does is says, this is not okay when we see something wrong in the world. When nobody else has the courage to say it. And I want to ask you guys, what are the things that God is saying to you that are absolutely not okay? What are the injustices that he's particularly laid on our hearts today in our lives? There, of course, is definitely a place for peacekeeping. Of course there is. Sometimes peacekeeping is all that we're able to do for a short time. I'm thinking of like when you're going to see family at Christmas time for 24 hours and you're not necessarily going to change the whole dynamic of every relationship that's been difficult. You just need to keep the peace. Okay? Or a bit more kind of vitally, when there's conflict going around in the world, sometimes we just need to keep the peace and stop fighting from breaking out any further for another few months. But peacemaking always digs deeper and asks the question, who's winning here? Who's losing here? And what is the Holy Spirit saying about how I am to live in this context? So peacekeeping can often perpetuate injustice. Peacekeeping can even allow things like abuse to flourish because we say, oh, we didn't want to cause a scene, or we didn't want this organization or the church or my workplace to get a bad reputation, so we just thought we'd just pretend everything was okay. But there are some things that will even challenge the importance of unity and peacekeeping, and injustice is one of them. So when Jesus calls this bunch of religious leaders a brood of vipers, he's doing that because there's such a strong sense of injustice within him as the Holy Spirit guides him, that's rising up, that for him just to be somebody that keeps the peace and just sing Kumbaya would be to deny the true Shalom of God in that context. So he could not stay silent in the face of the perversion of Judaism in his own context. So Jesus was ushering in Shalom into a world with no Shalom. In a world that's obsessed and being shaped by violence and war and wealth and money. The Shalom of God's kingdom is breaking in. So where have we recognized a lack of peace? I've asked you that question already, but is it a neighbor who's just got no support, who's actually just isolated, or who's supposed to have a certain amount of support but just isn't getting it? Are they struggling to get by? Is it systemic racism in the organization that you work for, or that you see maybe even in your own family? Is it a world where abuse often gets swept under the carpet? It could be any number of things. But as Jesus gave this speech on the hillside, he set the wheels in motion for more peacemakers to follow. And here are some words from the prophet Jeremiah that I think kind of help us understand the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. He says, "From the least to the greatest, all are greedy for gain. Prophets and priests alike all practice deceit." So, wow, okay, that was a big thing to say back then. He's criticizing the church. He's criticizing not just the people out there, but the people within as well. And he says, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious." So they put a plaster on something that needs surgery. I don't know why I've just started preaching on Jeremiah, but I have. "And peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." Does that make sense? That last little phrase. They say peace, but really they're not looking and digging deeper to see what's really going on. Peacemaking is not passive, because peacemaking addresses the lack of peace in our world. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, on one hand you've got the devil's peace, and on the other hand you've got God's true peace, which I think is, I'd never heard that concept, and really just made me kind of think, where have I settled for a peace that is not God's true Shalom in the world? And most of us know, if you know anything about civil rights campaigning in the States, you know that Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't scared of making a few enemies in the name of peace as he sought God's kingdom, because it cost him his life, didn't it, eventually? And Jesus also wasn't scared of disrupting things. Next week we're going to be thinking about blessed are those who are persecuted. I'm not going to go into that. I'm already preaching 3 sermons already. But Jesus wasn't scared of disrupting things. God, in his time, had been commandeered by too many. God had become a way of just making money for some people. God had become a way of controlling people for a lot of the leaders. Jesus said, "This is not okay. This is absolutely not okay." And he showed them the way of Shalom, and it cost him his life. In his letter to the believers in Rome, the Apostle Paul said, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." It kind of sounds a little bit like the way that Claudia and I are speaking to each other when we're super tired. "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, would you be able to grab me a glass of water from the kitchen, please?" Thank you for being so polite. We're doing pretty well. But it's so funny the way that Paul speaks. It won't always be possible. It won't always be possible. John Lewis, not the home furnishing store with the great Christmas adverts, but the civil rights activist from the States who died last year. I think we've got a photo of him there, yeah. a really interesting guy. He talked about making good trouble. So he said, never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. That takes wisdom, doesn't it? To know when to do that, when to step out. Because what isn't true is that the call of Christians is to only be running around, antagonizing people the whole time, starting fires and never putting them out. Of course, the role of peacemakers must often be reconciling. You know, we've got to be people that, highlight injustice, but also people that bring people together. So that takes wisdom to know when to do what. In Matthew 5, in the same chapter, or the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, be reconciled to one another. He also says, love your enemies. So he doesn't let us off the hook in any way. And we're blessed when we take time to stand in the gap between friends that have fallen out. You know, that we're living in blessing there. We're blessed when we're the first to say sorry to a friend or a partner, whether they're a hedgehog or a rhino, however it's played out. Just thinking about Jesus as peacemaker. He had the courage to criticize oppressors, but he also cared about people deeply. He forgave those who hurt him. He practiced reconciliation, and he also rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a war horse. So he was looking for shalom in his community, but he was also looking for shalom in relationships. He showed us that neither is passive and that neither happens by accident. You know, interpersonal reconciliation is exhausting. You know, when we've fallen out with people and we try and make up with them, that is tiring, isn't it? But unforgiveness can be a killer. And allowing relationships to heal also allows us to heal and other people to heal too. Likewise, peacemaking in our communities will demand a lot of us too. I've just got a couple of things, a couple of soapbox things. Soapbox. Can you say that? Can we all say that? Soapbox? See? It's all right for you to sit there, isn't it? But I've got to stand up here. Say these difficult things each week. So, I want to talk about the difference between posting on social media, raising awareness, showing people what you care about. I think that's great. I think that's really important that we do that. But I also want to say it's nowhere near as important. It doesn't even measure on the Richter scale when you compare it to local peacemaking. When you compare it to getting to know your community, finding out who the people are who you can get alongside, when it comes to finding out what the issues are. I've got this that's my little catchphrase, which I'm sure is going to go viral. Social needs versus local needs. So I'm quite tired at the moment, so yeah. Let's just have this little diagram that I loved. So this is a little diagram from a woman called Michelle Nicole, and where it says justice, advocacy. I want us to think about peacemaking, okay? So she says, what you think peacemaking is about. And it's quite small, but arguing and debating folks about injustice, knowing all the social justice language, and protesting and signing petitions, reading books, and watching TED Talks. So all good things. She says, what you think peacemaking is about. Let's have the next slide. And so she challenges us and says, what peacemaking is really about is connecting with community, reflecting and finding joy and resting. Isn't that interesting? Unpacking how you contribute to oppression yourself, and setting your intentions and goals for advocacy and action. So we can't do everything, can we? Can't do everything. Often it's overwhelming thinking about everything that's going on in the world, and all we do is we just end up posting a few things and thinking, right, I'm in the right river, or I'm in the right stream. But this challenge is to get involved locally, to know what's happening, and to really be the hands and feet of Jesus. One of the bits of advice in the book that I'm reading about peacemaking said, it had a little chapter heading saying, start a community garden. And I felt enormously smug when I read that. Completed it, mate. But we're only just starting, the whole vision for connecting with more people, and that being a place where people can come and find connection. And And so there are other questions that we can ask, aren't there? Where are the people who are already bringing shalom in our communities? Or where is the lack of peace? What is not okay? And we're not just social justice fighters. We are followers of Jesus. We are Christians, and we carry God's Spirit with us everywhere we go. So where can we usher in and join in with the presence of God? That's got to be the most important question. What is God leading us into? Jesus didn't just do stuff for the sake of it because he felt obliged or he wanted to fit in. He said, I only see what my Father in heaven doing already. And that is the challenge, isn't it? About resting, about knowing our limits, but also knowing what we're called to do too. So having a clear picture of what God is like and his character is so essential to being somebody who's a peacemaker. We have to know before we even start that we are the children of God. Just as the second half of that phrase says, we have to know that we are blessed when we're broken and when we mourn and when we're going through hard times. We have to know that God is with us before we can even begin to think about helping others. In Ephesians 2, Paul talks about Jesus and says, he himself is our peace. Don't know if you've read that bit in Ephesians 2 before. Jesus himself is our peace because he's torn down the dividing lines, the divisions between Jews and Gentiles then, but also he's torn down the division that was brought about between enmity between us and God. And he's made it possible for us to walk differently and live differently. And he's building a new people from the embers, the ashes of division. He's building something beautiful. A broken people, a blessed people who bring shalom into the world. And he started it all off at the cross. At the cross. So he's healing hearts and he's placing peace inside of us. And his perfect love is come to cast out all fear and to enable us to live this life that he's called to.